roll. Porter Halyburton, take one.
You know, I write down quotes that seem particularly meaningful to me in this little book sometimes, along with a lot of other things. And one of them I wrote, "The life which is unexamined is not worth living." And that was said by Plato. And so I wrote, one of the benefits of captivity was time. Time to think about important things and make life-changing and life-directing decisions. The result of this for me was the making of a life statement, a simple declaration of what I wanted my life to mean or stand for at the moment of my death. This statement has been revised many times, usually to make it shorter, in order to get at the essence of the meaning of my life, or what I want it to mean. This helps to set goals and priorities, a roadmap for the journey of life. From time to time, we all need to go to a personal retreat to reassess our goals, activities, values, and priorities. Then we need to discuss these things with those we love. It was this sort of process that led me to the third stage of my psychological adjustment to captivity. And so, the most current life statement. At the end, I wish to look back upon a fruitful Christian life lived as an honest man who has constantly striven to improve himself and the world in which he lives, and to die forgiven by God with the love and respect of my family and friends and the peace of the Lord in my soul.
Beautiful. Could you tell us, Porter, a little bit of the story about how you arrived at that? In the beginning, you had these life plans and you kept adding things, and then you just tell a little bit.
Yeah, this statement in the beginning, when I first wrote down everything, I thought I wanted to put down everything that I wanted to accomplish in my life and the things I wanted to have, and all of this kind of stuff. And it was a pretty long list, and the more I thought about it, you know, I came to the conclusion that most of those things were not important. You know, it wasn't the things you had or the titles that you had or anything like that. It was what your life stood for and the kind of person that you were up at the end of your life. That was the important thing. And so that's why this is a pretty short little statement now, you know, and instead of a long, very specific one.
Beautiful, beautiful. I'm going to tighten that a little bit. Hold on 1 second, Porter.
Mm-hmm.
Just here. You good, Cap?
Yes.
Okay.
I have my own tombstone, and so in 2002, I was looking at it, and I guess I was struck by a couple of things, and so I wrote this about it. I have a tombstone in my garden under the grape arbor that says I died on October 17th, 1965. Son of Catherine Porter Halyburton, husband of Martha Carroll Durison, father of Dabney Larimer Halyburton. If my life stood for nothing more, I would be satisfied to have been a son, a husband, a father. But the Lord chose to give me much more, testing me with a long separation from those that I loved and the freedom that I had taken for granted. He subjected me to time and trial, and I had to choose which way to go. He gave me years of trial and decision, and many more years of joy, happiness, freedom, and prosperity. Each time I look at that stone, I give thanks, but wonder, why was I spared when others were not? Their names on a black stone from which there is no return. I know that freedom has a taste, a feeling, and a sweetness that cannot be known by those who have not had it deprived. And yet, among the hundreds of millions of people who have never known freedom, there's an innate desire for it. Even among the most oppressed, there are those who struggle and sacrifice for it, somehow knowing that individual freedom will ensure it for all. God gives us this freedom to choose, and we can accept the gift or not. That's a choice in itself. So many of us bind ourselves in the prisons of hatred, prejudice, greed, lust, and pride, that we fail to see the happiness that lies within our grasp, if only we choose. And yet, we do not always choose wisely. We make mistakes and are weak. It is so God's grace and the help of others, His agents, that we see the truth and are led along the right paths. Often we go astray.
Beautiful, beautiful.
Okay.
Just a little bit more. Hold on one second, let me reframe.
I also wrote, my friend, companion, and hero, Fred Cherry, passed away on February the 16th, 2016, at the age of 87. So, shall I read a couple of poems?
Yes, sir.
Usually, if in a talk, I will begin with usually read 3 poems. And I read one at the beginning because I say, things were very different at the beginning than they were at the end. Many things changed. So this was written very early in my experience there when we thought the war was going to be short. And it's called Winter Crypt. How can I describe the way that I feel? As if the stream I was crossing had suddenly frozen and locked my ankles in an icy grip, immobilizing that once fluid force, and I with it. And we have nothing to do but wait until the thaw. Then at the end of my talk, I often end with another poem which was written later and certainly describes more of how I feel or how I felt towards the end after going through a great deal of stuff. And it's called Reflections on Captivity. How can I measure the loss of my dimensions as I lie spread across this crass expanse of time? Bitter years, devoid of latitude or luster, my duty days of trial and decision, are but pages turned, but pages not forgotten. Those countless hours of aimless retrospection, regret, restraint, and introspection, the strange monotony of unrewarded hopes, unconquered hopes, amidst my unborn tears, have tempered the metal of my structure and filled the empty spaces of my soul. Another one that I often read is called The Three of Us, and it goes along with a picture, the first picture that I got in, I think it was in a package, and this was a picture of Marty and Dabney is about I guess 4 years old, maybe. And this became the most precious thing I had, was this picture.
Are you getting that? Okay, I got it.
So I wrote about it. This is called The Three of Us. Yesterday, on meeting you, hoping without knowing you, knowing without asking you, loving without telling you. The young and misty two of us, sharing each the best of us, accepting too the worst of us, and we so good for both of us. And as for me, the faulty one, the wild and hungry, needy one, to spend my life in search of one and finding you the perfect one. And so we shared our pastel days, our soft and glowing magic days, and you with child within those days, and then our few but perfect days. Now 2 of you to wait for me, to love, to hope, to pray for me, and I still feel you part of me, though you and she so far from me. The future still so bright for us, for you, for me, for 3 of us, and she, the best of each of us, will fill the lives of both of us. Okay. Let me see.
Do you want to do this now?
After
Oh,
it's
okay.
done, that's done. Thank you.
I don't know whether you're interested in any other later poetry or not.
Yes, absolutely.
See what might be interesting. We were in Vietnam in 2008, November of 2008, and I was thinking of, Oriental haiku. So I wrote a little haiku called Short Haiku in Vietnam. To live life, one must choose to do or not to do. The memory of life brings both joy and sorrow. And then here are several versions of my life statement, which let's see. This was written on February the 1st, 1973, just 11 days before we were released, called Metamorphosis. Trembling and silent before the threshold, we stand on the eve of our resurrection, hardly daring to believe that at last the valve may crack and we may seep into the tip of an infinitely expanding horn, to be belched into that crowded carnival, an old song. She stands before me, silent, across the wide river, her smile seen dimly through the damp fog. Watching through my peephole, I can only whisper her name, Freedom. And I, within my hardened shell, await rebirth.
Did you write that on toilet paper, or did you have something to write on that end?
No, I memorized it all. Yeah. I wrote things down towards the end when, they weren't so particular about things. Actually, my photograph, I had quite a few photographs that Marty sent. And I used the back of them to write things down. Yeah.
Would you mind, because we got interrupted by a phone in the middle of reading that again?
Oh, sure. Ready?
And say again that you wrote this 11 days before.
Yeah, this poem called Metamorphosis I wrote about 11 days before we were actually released. And of course we were thinking about release during that time. So, Metamorphosis. Trembling and silent before the threshold, we stand on the eve of our resurrection, hardly daring to believe that at last the valve may crack and we may seep into the tip of an infinitely expanding horn, to be belched into that crowded carnival, an old song. She stands before me, silent, across the wide river, her smile seen dimly through the damp fog. Within my watching, I'm going to have to start over again. I blew a couple things anyway.
No problem, we're loving it.
This poem was written about 11 days before our actual day of freedom from Vietnam. And it's called Metamorphosis. Trembling and silent before the threshold, we stand on the eve of our resurrection, hardly daring to believe that at last the valve may crack and we may seep into the tip of an infinitely expanding horn, to be belched into that crowded carnival, an old song. She stands before me, silent, across the wide river, her smile seen dimly through the damp fog. Watching through my peephole, I can only whisper her name, Freedom. And I, within my hardened shell, await rebirth. All right. And I got a lot of song lyrics, but I'm not going to sing them. Here's a poem that I wrote, actually sitting kind of right here, looking right out this window. As they were taking down trees, we were clearing out some pine trees and so on. And as I watched the process of the tree man taking down the tree, I just thought about that as something important. And so this is called Old Pine, a poem in tree verse. And it's written in tree verse. Old pine has gotten in the way of other things that must come in. He was once young like us, but has grown old and scraggy. No more the seed, the sapling, the young buck, springing up amid his kin and neighbors, searching for light above and sweet nourishment below. Once he held his own and thrived to send out his own progeny, hosting squirrels and jays and tiny crawling things that bit and bored his brown bark. But now his time has come, like us, to move aside for newer things, for the next of these in this fine place, for them to settle in and grow and thrive as he once did. With saw and axe his limbs are cut, falling in profusion to the needles below that mark the passage of his former glory in a carpet of brown and crunchy detritus. And then the top, once his crown, his apex, comes down with a crash, and he is now a bare stalk, a pole that stands alone, surrounded by the chips and chunks of his life. We pause to look at him now, his stumpy torso scarred and pierced, waiting for the final indignation. We remembered his shade, his swaying beauty, and the rustling of his leaves, the yellow dust of his yearly thrusting. The logs are stacked upon the ground, the branches chipped into mulch, and hauled away, leaving only the bleeding stump and hidden roots below, useless and unwanted. And now the grinder comes and slowly, viciously grinds the stubborn part into chips and bits that will soon decay and feed the soil its fiber, its blood, all that remains of a good and mundane life. The ground is raked smooth, the grave unmarked, but for the sweet smell of sap that clings to the air like some tenacious announcement that old pine was here, but grew old and had to move aside. That's probably enough.
Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Truly an inspiration.
Okay.
Yeah, cutting.